The Arizona desert was quiet after the storm of bullets. Smoke still rose from broken windows, and the dry wind carried the smell of gunpowder. The small town of Dry Creek looked like a battlefield. Horses kicked nervously near the hitching post, and dust covered everything. A few men stood in the street, their faces pale, their hands shaking. The shootout was over. Among them was Ethan Cole, a tall cowboy with a calm face and tired eyes. He wasn't one for violence. He came to Dry Creek just to sell his cattle, maybe buy supplies and ride back to his lonely ranch. But that day, fate had other plans for him. When a group of outlaws rode into town shooting wildly, Ethan had no choice but to draw his gun. He didn't think. He just reacted. The townsfolk hid behind barrels and wagons, but Ethan stayed in the open, firing only when he had to. He didn't miss. By the time the sheriff arrived with his men, the fight was nearly done. 3 outlaws lay in the dust, and the rest had fled toward the hills. Now, as the sun began to sink behind the ridge, the town tried to come back to life. The saloon keeper swept broken glass off the porch. A few men carried the wounded to the doctor's office. Children peeked out from behind door frames, whispering about the quiet cowboy who had saved them. Ethan stood beside his horse, brushing dust from its mane. He wasn't proud or smiling. His hands were still shaking, though he hit it well. Killing even in defense never sat right with him. He looked at the bodies on the ground and thought of all the blood he'd seen during his years as a cattle hand. It didn't matter who fired first. Death always left a mark. As night came, the sheriff called him into the saloon. Lanterns glowed softly, and men raised their mugs in his honor. "To the man who saved our town," the sheriff said. Everyone cheered, but Ethan just gave a polite nod. He didn't want a drink nor the attention. Then someone unexpected entered, Chief Taji, the leader of a nearby Apache tribe. He was an older man with silver hair tied back, his face strong and proud. Behind him stood a few warriors, and beside them, a young woman. Her name was Nita, though Ethan didn't know it yet. The room fell silent. The Apache and settlers rarely shared the same space peacefully, but tonight was different. Chief Taji spoke through the sheriff, his voice low but clear. "The man you call Ethan saved my son today. He stood between life and death with courage. For this, our people offer a gift and a gesture of peace." He turned slightly, and the young woman stepped forward. She wore simple tribal clothing, her long black hair braided, her dark eyes calm and unreadable. The chief said something in his language, and the sheriff translated awkwardly. "He offers his daughter to you, Ethan, as a token of thanks, and as a bridge between your people and his." Ethan froze. He didn't know what to say. Around the room, men whispered, some smiling, others frowning. The old bartender muttered, "That's a rare honor, son." But Ethan didn't feel honored. He felt confused. He looked at the young woman, standing so still, her chin raised. She didn't look frightened. There was something strong about her. Pride, maybe, or pain he couldn't understand. Ethan cleared his throat. "Tell him I don't take gifts that breathe," he said quietly. The sheriff hesitated, unsure if he should translate those words. Chief Taji waited patiently, eyes on Ethan. After a pause, Ethan added, "But tell him I mean no disrespect." The chief studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded, saying something to his daughter. She looked at Ethan again, not with anger, but curiosity. Finally, Chief Taji said, "She will stay with you for a while, not as property, as a sign that peace can live where blood has fallen." And just like that, the matter was settled. Before Ethan could protest again, the chief and his people left. The saloon was silent once more. Everyone stared at Ethan and the young woman, waiting for him to say something. But he didn't. He simply tipped his hat and walked out into the night. Outside, the air was cool. The moon rose above the canyon, silver light painting the land. Nita followed quietly behind him. She didn't ask where they were going, and he didn't tell her. He saddled his horse, then looked at her. "There's a spare horse by the stable," he said. "You can ride it if you like." She gave a small nod, climbed onto the horse, and followed as he rode out of town. The ride was long and silent. The desert stretched wide around them, endless sand, rocks, and starlight. Ethan could hear only the soft rhythm of hooves and the sound of her quiet breathing behind him. He kept wondering why she didn't say anything. Maybe she didn't want to be there. Maybe she was as confused as he was. When they reached his small ranch near the edge of the canyon, the sun was already rising again. The place was simple. A wooden cabin, a small barn, a well, and a few fenced acres of land. Ethan got down from his horse and led the way. "You can stay in the house," he said. "I'll take the barn tonight," but she shook her head. "I will sleep under the sky," she said softly, her voice calm but strong. Ethan nodded, not wanting to argue. He brought her a blanket and some water. She accepted both, thanking him with a quiet nod. Then she sat by the fire, eyes fixed on the horizon. Ethan went inside, though he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching her through the glass. She didn't seem scared. She didn't seem angry. Just distant, like someone carrying a story too heavy to tell. Later that night, the wind picked up, blowing dust across the land. The stars shone bright, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. Ethan poured himself a small drink but didn't touch it. He looked again at the woman outside, wrapped in her blanket, still awake. He wondered what she thought of him. The man who had fought her people's enemies, the man who had been handed her as a gift he didn't want. When dawn came, she was still sitting there. The fire had gone cold. Ethan stepped outside quietly and said, "There's coffee if you want some." She turned to him and gave a faint smile, the first he'd seen. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. That morning, Ethan realized something. Life on the frontier wasn't just about surviving dust, hunger, or bullets. It was also about learning to live with what you didn't understand. He didn't know what would happen with this Apache woman or how long she would stay. But deep down, he felt that something had shifted. For years, Ethan Cole had lived like a shadow, working hard, keeping quiet, never letting anyone close. But now, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone. He didn't ask for this, and yet it felt like the start of something he couldn't name. Maybe peace. Maybe forgiveness. That night, as the moon rose again over Dry Creek, the cowboy sat on his porch with his hat in his hands, listening to the wind move through the grass. Somewhere nearby, Nita hummed a soft Apache tune. The sound floated through the night, gentle and sad, wrapping around him like a memory from another world. And though he didn't understand the words, he felt the meaning when it was a song about loss, about courage, and about finding light even after blood had fallen on the land. For the first time since the gunfire, Ethan Cole closed his eyes and let himself breathe. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing. The world was changing, and maybe, just maybe, it was changing for the better. The morning sun rose over the quiet ranch, painting the sky in soft orange and gold. The land was calm now, only the sound of roosters crowing and the slow creak of wind against the wooden fence. Ethan Cole stepped out of his cabin, stretching his arms. He was used to being alone, used to silence. But that morning, the silence felt different. It was no longer empty. By the fire pit near the corral, Nita was already awake. She had started a small fire and was roasting corn over it. Her hair glowed in the sunlight, dark and shining. She didn't look up when Ethan walked over, but she knew he was there. She handed him a piece of roasted corn without a word. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded and went back to her work. For the first few days, they spoke very little. Ethan tried to give her space. He didn't want her to feel trapped or unwanted. She slept under the stars every night and woke before him every morning. She gathered wild herbs near the stream, fetched water, and even helped feed his horses. She moved gracefully as if she belonged to the land itself. Ethan had met many people in his travels. Loud traders, drunk cowhands, talkative cooks. But he had never met anyone like her. She didn't fill the air with noise. She filled it with calm. Even the horses seemed quieter when she was around. At first, Ethan thought she was only being polite. But one evening, as the sun dipped low, he caught her standing near the fence humming a soft tune. It was a melody so beautiful and lonely that it stopped him in his tracks. When she noticed him watching, she turned away quickly, embarrassed. Ethan smiled faintly but said nothing. That night, while she sat by the fire, he finally spoke. "You don't have to stay here," he said softly. "If you want to go back to your people, I can take you." She looked at him for a long moment before replying. Her voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "I know, but I will stay. My father sent me here to bring peace. If I leave, he will think peace is broken." Ethan nodded slowly. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I know," she said again. "But maybe I owe it to the land. Too much blood has fallen on it." Her words surprised him. They weren't what he expected from someone so young. There was wisdom in her, the kind that came from seeing too much too soon. Ethan looked into the fire, then said, "You're not afraid?" She shook her head. "Fear is for those who think they can change fate. I don't. I just walk the path I'm given." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. He admired her strength, but also felt a strange sadness. He'd seen strong people before, soldiers, rangers, sheriffs, but their strength was born from anger or pride. Nita's strength came from peace. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, they began to speak more. She taught him Apache words for the things around them: wind, horse, fire, river. He taught her simple English phrases, laughing quietly when she pronounced them differently. In return, she showed him how to read the land, how to tell if rain was coming by watching the ants, or how to follow a trail without leaving prints. Sometimes, in the evenings, she would tell him stories about her tribe. Once, she said, "The land spoke to our people through dreams. My grandmother said the earth remembers everything, and even kindness." Ethan listened carefully. He didn't interrupt. He liked how her stories sounded, soft, slow, and full of heart. One evening after they finished dinner, Ethan found her sitting on the porch steps, looking at the moon. He sat beside her, careful not to break the quiet. After a long pause, she spoke without looking at him. "You saved my brother," she said. "That's why my father sent me." Ethan turned to her, surprised. "Your brother?" She nodded. "He was with the traders near the town when the outlaws came. He was the boy you pulled behind the wagon." Ethan remembered, the small boy hiding near the gunfire. He had grabbed the child by the arm and dragged him out of harm's way, just before a bullet struck the wall. "He's your brother?" Ethan asked softly. "Yes," she said. "My father thought giving me to you would make our peace strong. But—" She paused, her hands tightening slightly. "I am not something to be given." Ethan didn't answer at once. The words hit him deep. Finally, he said, "I never wanted that either." For a moment, they just sat there in silence. The moonlight touched their faces. Nita looked at him with calm eyes and said, "Then we understand each other." From that night, something changed between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was trust. The kind of quiet understanding that doesn't need words. The people in town, however, didn't understand. When Ethan went to buy supplies, the townsfolk whispered behind his back, "He's keeping that Apache woman on his ranch," someone said at the general store. Another muttered, "That ain't right." Ethan ignored them. He wasn't a man who cared for gossip. But deep down, he worried how the talk might affect her. When he returned home, he told Nita what people were saying. She only smiled. "Let them talk," she said. "Words can't change who I am." He admired that about her, the way she stayed calm even when others judged her. But at night, he noticed how she looked toward the hills, her eyes distant. Maybe she missed her people. Maybe she missed freedom. One day, while fixing the barn roof, Ethan saw her near the corral, running her fingers gently along the neck of his horse. She was whispering something softly in Apache. The horse, usually restless, stood perfectly still. It was as if it understood her. Ethan climbed down and asked, "What did you say to him?" She smiled slightly. "I told him not to be afraid of the wind." Ethan chuckled. "He's afraid of everything, even the fence creaking." She looked at him, her eyes warm. "Then you must teach him that the world is not always against him." Ethan froze. Somehow he knew she wasn't just talking about the horse anymore. She was talking about him. From that day forward, they worked together on the ranch. She cooked, mended his shirts, and even learned to ride like the cowhands. Ethan showed her how to rope a calf, though she fell off twice before laughing about it. In return, she showed him how to track deer using broken grass and stones. At night, they sat by the fire. Sometimes she told him about her dreams, about rivers running red and stars that vanished when men forgot kindness. Ethan didn't always understand, but he listened. Something about her voice made the dark feel softer. One morning, while Ethan was repairing the fence, Nita came up behind him and said quietly, "I want to tell you something." He wiped sweat from his brow and looked at her. "What is it?" She hesitated. "I have decided to stay until the land is healed. My father believes peace lives here now. So do I." Ethan nodded slowly. "You're welcome here for as long as you wish." Nita gave a small smile. "Then it is settled." She turned to walk away, but before she did, she looked back. "Ethan," she said softly, "you carry too much silence inside. Someday you must let it go." He didn't reply, but her words stayed with him. That night, as he sat by the fire alone, he realized she was right. He had been carrying guilt and loneliness for years, from gunfights, from lost friends, from the life he'd chosen. And somehow this woman, who had been given to him as a gift he never wanted, was teaching him how to live again. As the days passed, the distance between them faded. They were no longer strangers or symbols of peace. They were two souls trying to understand a world that often forgot kindness. Sometimes, when Ethan rode into town, he saw the stares, heard the whispers. That's the cowboy living with the Apache woman. But when he rode back home and saw Nita sitting by the fire waiting for him, those words meant nothing. He had stopped caring what people thought. He only cared about the quiet strength that filled the air when she was near, the same strength that made him believe, maybe for the first time in his life, that peace wasn't just an idea. It was something you could build, one honest choice at a time. Summer rolled across the desert like a slow fire. The days were longer now, the heat sharper, and the land around Ethan's ranch shimmered under the sun. Life had settled into a quiet rhythm between him and Nita. She tended to the animals, collected herbs, and sometimes rode into the nearby hills at dawn, her figure small against the wide-open sky. Ethan had grown used to her presence, the sound of her soft voice, the sight of her sitting by the window, weaving or humming an old song from her tribe. But peace on the frontier never lasted long. Rumors began to drift into town. Someone said cattle were missing from a nearby ranch. Someone else claimed an Apache hunting party had been seen near the river. The tension between the settlers and the Apache had always been fragile, like thin ice on a winter pond. One wrong step and it could all break. Ethan heard the whispers when he went into town for supplies. The men at the saloon talked loudly, anger rising with each drink. First they take our land, one rancher said, slamming his fist on the table. Now they're stealing our horses. If the sheriff doesn't stop them, we will. Ethan sat quietly at the corner listening. He didn't speak. He knew words in that place could spark fire faster than a match in dry grass. When he rode home that evening, the sky was painted red with sunset. Nita was outside grinding corn on a stone slab. She looked up when he arrived. "You heard something," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "The town's talking. They think your people took cattle." She didn't answer right away. Her hand stopped moving. "They always think we took something," she said finally. "But sometimes what they call stealing is what we call surviving." Ethan understood. The land was cruel that summer. The river had dried and the grass had turned brown. Hunger made people desperate no matter who they were. He leaned against the fence and sighed. "If they come for your people, it won't end well," he said. Nita looked at him, her dark eyes calm but sad. "Then maybe we must stop them before it begins." That night Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat on his porch listening to the crickets sing. The moon hung low, bright and pale. He thought about the sheriff, a good man, but one who followed the voice of the town. He thought about Chief Taji, who had trusted him once. And he thought about Nita, who had brought peace to his quiet world. Before dawn, smoke rose from the direction of the barn. Ethan ran out barefoot, heart racing. Flames licked the wood, bright and wild. He grabbed a bucket, shouting for Nita. Together they fought the fire, throwing water again and again until the flames finally died. The air smelled of smoke and ash. The horses were frightened but safe. Ethan knelt on the ground, panting. Someone had set that fire, he knew it. He found boot prints near the fence line, fresh and deep. When Nita saw them, she said softly, "They want you to fear me." Ethan clenched his jaw. "They'll get more than fear if they come back." But Nita shook her head. "No, if you fight, they'll call it proof. You'll lose everything you built here." Her words were calm, but he could see the pain behind them. She knew the world better than he did, knew how quickly people judged what they didn't understand. The next day, Ethan rode to town to speak with the sheriff. The man listened but looked uncomfortable. "You can't protect both sides, Ethan," he said. "The ranchers are angry. They're forming a posse to ride out by morning. They think the Apache camp took the stolen stock." Ethan felt his stomach twist. "That camp saved your town once," he said. "Those people aren't thieves." The sheriff sighed. "Maybe, but tell that to men who've lost half their herds." Ethan leaned closer. "You start this raid and you'll start a war." But the sheriff looked away. "It's already started in their minds." Ethan rode home faster than ever, dust trailing behind him like smoke. When he reached the ranch, Nita was waiting. She didn't need to ask what he'd heard. She could see it in his face. "They'll come for my father," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. By dawn, there was a long silence. Then she stood straight and firm. "Then I will go warn him." Ethan grabbed her arm gently. "No, they'll shoot on sight if they see you on the trail." She met his eyes without fear. "If I don't go, my people will die." For a moment they just stood there in the half-light of evening, two people from different worlds bound by one truth. Ethan took a deep breath. "Then I'm going with you," Nita blinked. "You would ride into an Apache camp at night?" "They will not trust you," he smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but your father might still remember the cowboy who refused his gift." Nita looked at him for a long time, then nodded. "Then we ride before the moon rises." They saddled the horses quickly. The desert was quiet except for the wind brushing against the tall grass. They rode side by side, the stars shining like silver dust above them. The ride was long, miles of open land, silent and dark. When they reached the Apache camp near the edge of the canyon, the guards stopped them immediately, arrows drawn. Nita called out in her language. After a tense moment, they let her through. Ethan followed slowly, keeping his hands where they could see them. Chief Taji stood near the fire, his face serious but calm. The years had made him wise, but even he looked tired of the endless fighting between white men and his people. Nita ran to him and spoke quickly in her tongue. The chief listened, his eyes shifting toward Ethan. Then he nodded. "You came to warn us," he said in broken English. His voice was deep and heavy like the desert wind. Ethan bowed his head slightly. "They're coming with guns," he said. "You need to move your people before dawn." The chief was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You choose peace, cowboy. Not many of your kind do." "I'm not choosing sides," Ethan said softly. "I'm choosing what's right." The chief's eyes softened. "That is what peace looks like." He gave orders to his people. Within minutes, the camp began to move. Women gathering children, men loading packs, horses saddled. The fire was put out, leaving only smoke curling into the night. As the tribe began their quiet retreat toward the mountains, Nita turned to Ethan. "You should go back. If they find you with us, they'll call you a traitor." He shook his head. "I'll stay until you're safe." They rode with the tribe through the dark canyon. The path was narrow, the air cool and filled with echoes of hooves. Ethan looked back often, expecting to see torches or riders, but the horizon stayed empty. For now, when they reached the high cliffs before dawn, the first light of morning touched the world in gold. Nita looked back toward the valley and whispered, "Maybe peace will survive one more day." Ethan smiled tiredly. "That's all peace ever does, survive one more day." Just then a faint sound echoed from behind, the thundering of horses. The posse had reached the valley. Ethan turned his horse around. "Stay with your people," he said. "I'll ride down and talk to them." Nita's hand caught his arm. "If you go, they might kill you." He looked into her eyes and said softly, "Then let's make them listen before they do." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind brushed between them, carrying the scent of desert flowers and smoke. Then Nita nodded. "If you go, I go," she said firmly. Ethan wanted to protest, but he saw the fire in her eyes. It wasn't stubbornness, and it was courage. The same courage she had shown when she first walked into his life, unafraid of what the world thought. Together, they rode back through the canyon, toward the coming storm. The sun climbed higher, painting the rocks in red and orange. Ethan could see the dust rising in the distance, riders coming fast, rifles gleaming. He felt no fear now, just a strange calm, the kind that comes when a man finally knows what he's fighting for. He looked at Nita riding beside him, her braid flying in the wind, her face calm and strong. "Whatever happens," he said, "thank you." She turned to him and smiled gently. "For what?" "For teaching me that peace is not weakness," he said. "It's the hardest thing a man can fight for." They rode on side by side, toward the sound of hooves and the uncertain dawn, where the line between enemy and friend would soon be tested by two hearts that chose courage over hate. The first light of dawn touched the canyon walls like a painting of fire and gold. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the sound of horses moving through narrow trails. Ethan Cole rode at the front beside Nita, his face calm but his eyes alert. Behind them, the Apache families moved quietly, mothers carrying children, elders leading ponies loaded with supplies. No one spoke. Every sound echoed off the red rocks. They were trying to reach the high valley before the sheriff's men arrived. It was their only chance. The narrow paths would protect them from bullets, and once they crossed the ridge, they could disappear into the mountain forest. Ethan knew the trail well. He'd used it once years ago while driving cattle north. Now he rode it not for profit, but for peace. The sun climbed slowly. Nita rode close, glancing back from time to time. The trail behind them was still empty, but she could feel it. Danger moving closer like a shadow. "They're coming," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "We just need a few more miles." The wind picked up, carrying dust and the faint thud of distant hooves. He knew she was right. The posse was on their trail. Every minute mattered. The group moved faster. Children were lifted onto horses. Packs were thrown aside to lighten the load. The land around them was wild and beautiful. Tall cliffs, shining stones, and a sky so blue it looked endless. Yet there was no time to admire it. Each sound behind them brought fear closer. As they reached the bend in the canyon, Ethan turned his horse and looked down the slope. Far in the distance, he saw dust clouds rising, men on horseback, rifles gleaming in the light. They were maybe half an hour away. Nita followed his gaze. "If they catch us here, we'll be trapped," she said. Ethan's mind raced. "There's a split ahead," he said quickly. "You lead the families east through the ravine. I'll ride west and make them follow me." Nita's eyes widened. "No, they'll shoot you." He smiled faintly. "Maybe, but if I don't, they'll shoot all of you." She shook her head, gripping her reins. "No. I ride with you." Ethan wanted to argue, but he saw the strength in her face, the same strength she'd shown that first night, standing proud while others tried to decide her fate. He realized there was no changing her mind. "All right," he said quietly, "but stay behind me." They broke off from the group, turning their horses toward the west. The tribe continued eastward, their figures disappearing between tall red rocks. Dust filled the air as Ethan and Nita galloped down the canyon path. The sound of gunfire broke the silence. Sharp cracks echoed across the cliffs. Ethan ducked low, urging his horse faster. The posse had spotted them. He could hear the men shouting behind them. "Go!" Ethan yelled. Nita's horse ran alongside his, her braid flying behind her like a black ribbon. She didn't look scared. Her eyes were fixed ahead, calm and bright. They rode hard through the canyon, the sound of hooves thundering against the rock walls. At one sharp turn, Ethan stopped suddenly. He jumped off his horse, grabbed a large rock, and rolled it toward the narrow path. It tumbled down, breaking smaller stones with it. Within seconds, a small landslide covered part of the trail. "That'll slow them down," he said, breathing hard. Nita looked back. The riders were closer now, tiny dots in the dust but moving fast. "Not for long," she said. They mounted again and continued toward a wider clearing surrounded by cliffs. It was a place where the canyon opened up before climbing again. The land there was dry but full of tall sage bushes and wildflowers. Ethan stopped his horse, turning to face the direction they came from. "We'll stand here," he said. Nita frowned. "You mean fight?" "Not fight," he said. "Talk." Moments later, the posse appeared, a dozen men led by the sheriff. Their horses slowed as they spotted Ethan and Nita waiting. The sheriff raised a hand. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" Ethan rode forward slowly. "You don't need to go further," he said. "They're gone." "You won't find them," one of the ranchers shouted angrily. "You hiding them, Cole? Those thieves took my cattle." Ethan's voice was steady. "No one stole your cattle, Hank. They're just trying to stay alive." The sheriff frowned. "Step aside, Ethan. We need to check that canyon." Ethan shook his head. "No one's down there. If you go shooting today, it'll start something you can't stop." Behind him, Nita moved her horse forward. She didn't draw a weapon. Instead, she raised her hand, palm open, showing peace. Her calmness made even the sheriff hesitate. The men looked uneasy, their rifles still in hand. One rancher, a hot-tempered man named Clancy, cursed loudly. "We don't talk to them!" he shouted. "We shoot before they shoot us." He lifted his rifle. But before he could aim, Nita rode between him and Ethan, her hand still raised. "No more killing," she said clearly. Her voice echoed through the canyon. The sheriff looked stunned. "You speak English?" "Yes," she said. "Enough to know peace is better than blood." The wind fell silent. No one moved. Ethan could hear his heart beating. He looked at the sheriff and said, "You know me, Tom, you know I don't lie. There's no war here unless you start one." The sheriff stared at him for a long time. Then he lowered his gun. "Call it off, boys," he said. "We're not spilling blood today." The men muttered in protest, but the sheriff's voice turned hard. "That's an order." One by one, the rifles lowered. Clancy spat on the ground but turned his horse around. "You're a fool, Cole," he said bitterly. "One day you'll regret siding with them." Ethan didn't reply. He watched as the posse rode off slowly, their anger fading into the dust. When the last rider disappeared, the canyon fell quiet again. The wind blew softly through the sage bushes, carrying the smell of rain far away. Ethan turned to Nita. "You could have been shot," he said quietly. She looked at him and smiled faintly. "So could you." They stood there for a moment, letting the silence breathe. The land around them seemed larger, calmer, as if it too had been holding its breath. After a while, Nita said softly, "They will not forget today." "Some will hate you for this," Ethan shrugged. "I've been hated before." She smiled gently. "And yet you chose peace." He looked away toward the horizon. "Maybe because I've seen too much war," he said. "And maybe because I finally found something worth protecting." The ride back through the canyon was slow and peaceful. The danger had passed, but something deeper had changed. Ethan rode beside Nita, the silence between them no longer heavy but full of understanding. When they reached the ridge where the Apache families had gone, Chief Taji was waiting. He saw them coming and walked forward. His eyes were full of pride. "You stopped blood from falling," he said. "That is the hardest battle of all." Ethan nodded. "It wasn't just me." He looked at Nita. The chief placed his hand gently on his daughter's shoulder. "Then both of you carry the spirit of peace," he said. "May it guide the land." That evening, the Apache moved deeper into the mountains where the settlers could not reach them easily. Ethan stayed behind, watching as the last of their fires faded in the distance. Nita stood beside him, the wind tugging at her hair. "You could go with them," he said softly. "It would be safer." She looked at him, her eyes warm and steady. "My place is where peace still needs to grow," she said. Ethan nodded slowly. They stood there together as the last light of day slipped behind the cliffs. The air smelled of rain and sage, and for the first time in a long while the land felt alive, as if it too was healing. That night, they camped by the canyon's edge. The stars shone brighter than ever. Nita sat by the fire, quietly singing one of her tribal songs, the same melody she had once hummed outside his cabin. Ethan listened, his heart calm. He finally understood the meaning of her song. It wasn't about sorrow or loss. It was about hope, about how even after darkness, the sun always finds its way back. As he lay down beneath the open sky, Ethan whispered softly, "Maybe that's what peace sounds like." And somewhere in the distance the land seemed to answer, not with words, but with the gentle rhythm of wind through the canyon, carrying the promise of a better dawn. The months that followed the canyon standoff passed slowly, like the turning of the seasons across the quiet desert. The rains came, soft and late, washing away the dust and the memory of gunfire. The grass returned, green and fresh. The animals grazed calmly again. For the first time in many years, the valley knew peace. Ethan Cole's ranch looked different now. The barn had been rebuilt, stronger and cleaner. The fences were mended, and the small garden behind his cabin had begun to bloom with sunflowers and beans. The world seemed lighter, but deep inside, Ethan knew peace was fragile. Something that had to be cared for every day, like a fire that could go out if left alone too long. Nita still lived on the ranch. She hadn't gone back to the mountains with her people, though her father had invited her many times. When Ethan asked her why she stayed, she smiled and said simply, "Because the land still needs healing, Wang, and so do you." They had built an easy rhythm together. Each morning, Ethan would saddle the horses while Nita fetched water and started the fire. She often sang softly as she cooked, old songs from her tribe that carried stories of the wind, the rain, and the spirit of the earth. Ethan didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. The songs brought peace to his heart, and that was enough. Sometimes they rode together to the nearby hills. Nita would gather herbs for medicine, and Ethan would check on the cattle grazing in the higher fields. They didn't talk much on those rides, but their silence was full of comfort. The wind, the horses, and the endless sky said enough. One afternoon, as they rested under a tall cottonwood tree, Nita looked at the horizon. "You change things," she said softly. Ethan looked up from his saddlebag. "How do you mean?" "You stopped men from fighting," she said. "You made them see that we are not enemies. You planted peace like a seed." Ethan smiled faintly. "A seed can still die if no one waters it." Nita nodded slowly. "Then we will water it together." Her words touched him deeply. There was something honest in them, something that went beyond friendship or duty. They didn't speak of love, but it was there in every shared glance, in every kind act. It wasn't loud or hurried. It was quiet, patient, and real, but peace never stayed simple on the frontier. Word spread of what had happened in the canyon. How a cowboy had stood between settlers and Apaches to stop a war. Some people praised Ethan for his courage, but others called him a traitor. They said he'd turned his back on his own kind. When Ethan rode into town, people no longer smiled the way they used to. The general storekeeper kept his greetings short. A few men turned their heads when he passed. He felt the weight of their stares but said nothing. Nita noticed the change too. One evening she asked quietly, "Does it hurt you that they hate you now?" Ethan looked at the fire for a long moment before answering. "Maybe it should, but I've learned that being right doesn't always mean being liked." Nita nodded, her eyes gentle. "My father says the same. He says peace is the hardest road because no one thanks you for walking it." Ethan smiled faintly. "Your father is a wise man." The days grew shorter as autumn arrived. Golden leaves covered the ground and the air turned cool and crisp. Nita often went to visit her tribe for a few days at a time, carrying herbs and supplies. Each time she returned, Ethan felt the same quiet relief, though he never said it out loud. He'd grown used to her presence, the sound of her footsteps on the porch, her laughter when the horses misbehaved, her calm voice when he doubted himself. One evening, after returning from the mountains, Nita found Ethan repairing a broken fence post. The sun was setting, turning the sky orange and pink. She walked over and leaned against the fence. "You work even when the day is ending," she said with a small smile. Ethan chuckled. "The day doesn't end until the work's done." Nita watched him for a while, her eyes soft. "You could have had a wife in town," she said quietly. "Someone who would cook and sew for you. Someone they would approve of." Ethan paused, hammer still in his hand. He looked up at her, the golden light catching his tired face. "Maybe," he said. "But peace doesn't care about approval." Nita smiled faintly. "You still speak like a man who doesn't know he has a home." He looked at her for a long moment. "Maybe that's because I didn't have one until now." The silence that followed said everything they couldn't put into words. That night the wind blew softly outside as they sat near the fire. The flames flickered, throwing warm light on their faces. Nita took out a small woven cloth from her bag, a piece of Apache art she had made by hand. It showed a river winding through a desert valley, with two small figures riding side by side. She placed it on the table and said, "It's a gift." Ethan touched the cloth gently. "It's beautiful," he said. "It's our story," she said. "A cowboy and a woman who chose peace." Ethan looked at her quietly. "You're not just a story, Nita. You're the reason peace stayed alive." She smiled softly. "And you're the reason I still believe in people." The room fell quiet again, filled only by the soft crackle of firewood. In the weeks that followed, their friendship deepened into something quiet and unspoken. They didn't call it love. They didn't need to. It lived in the way he waited for her to finish her morning prayers, in the way she brought him water when he worked too long in the heat. It lived in their silence, steady as the desert wind. One winter morning, a messenger from town arrived. He brought news that surprised everyone. The sheriff had resigned, tired of endless arguments about justice and peace. Before leaving, he had written a short note for Ethan. It said simply, "You were right. The world needs more men like you." Ethan folded the note slowly and put it away. He didn't tell anyone, not even Nita. Some things, he thought, were meant to stay close to the heart. Years passed quietly. The small ranch grew into a home where both settlers and Apache travelers sometimes stopped to rest. Ethan and Nita offered food and water to anyone who came. No questions, no judgment. People began to call the place Peace Hollow. Children would sometimes ask, "Are you husband and wife?" Ethan would laugh softly and say, "We're just two souls who decided not to fight the world anymore." As time went on, Ethan grew older. his hair turning gray. Nita's face carried lines of wisdom, but her eyes remained bright and calm. They never married, but their bond was stronger than any promise made before a preacher. One spring evening, as the sun dipped low and the land glowed gold, Nita sat beside him on the porch. The smell of blooming flowers filled the air. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his hat tilted low. "Funny thing," he said quietly. "When I came to this valley, I thought it would be just another stop before moving on. But it became home." Nita smiled. "Home is not a place. It's a feeling you carry inside when you find peace." He nodded slowly. "You gave me that feeling." She looked at him, her voice gentle. "And you gave it back to the land." As the sky turned purple with twilight, they sat together watching the stars appear one by one. The world was still, no shouting, no gunfire, no hate. Just the hum of crickets and the soft rhythm of the earth breathing again. In that quiet moment, Ethan realized something he had never said aloud, that real strength wasn't in a gun or a fight. It was in mercy, in forgiveness, in the courage to lay down pride for the sake of peace. And though he knew time would carry their names away, he also knew the land would remember. The valley that had once seen war would forever hold the story of a cowboy and an Apache woman who chose a different path, not of ownership, but of respect. Years later, travelers passing through Peace Hollow still spoke of them. They said, "A man and a woman once lived here who stopped a war with kindness." And those who heard the story would smile and whisper, "Maybe peace isn't just a dream after all." The old cabin stood long after they were gone. The wind still moved through the fields, and sometimes when the night was still, the sound of a woman's song drifted across the land, soft, hopeful, and eternal, like the promise they left behind.